Hi, everybody. This is Brendon Baillod from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to put a couple of different presentations I've given in the past up on video for people to enjoy. I had a few requests for some of these. One of the talks that I gave many years ago, I gave this at the Great Lakes Historical Society at Vermilion, Ohio. It was at the time. It's since moved to Toledo. But I was there to speak at their annual dinner, and I gave a talk in the morning after the dinner called "Famous Wrecks That Never Happened." That was pretty well received, and so it caught people's attention just because of the name. But it really is designed to encourage people to think critically about maritime history and about Great Lakes shipwrecks. And so I'm going to dive right into this, and hopefully people enjoy it. Famous wrecks that never happened. So, I introduced the talk with sort of the birth of a legend, this story that many of you have seen on the page recently, and that's this article I came across when I was a young man. I was in my early 20s, and I used to go out to Isle Royale every year, the national park out in Lake Superior. I grew up in the Copper Country, and my dad had a big boat there, so we would frequently go to Isle Royale. And I started to dive the shipwrecks there, and I got interested in finding new wrecks out there. And as I was going through the Copper Country archives at Michigan Tech University, I come across this article: Three divers find a wrecked vessel at Isle Royale. And what caught my attention is that it was a vessel I had never heard of. It was a scow schooner called the San Antonio. Well, I had never heard of that ship. And to make matters worse, it was on a reef called San Antonio Reef. Now, that reef exists. That's something I'd seen on the maps many times, San Antonio Reef. It's off Point Houghton down in Siskiwit Bay. Uh, And I thought, well, how could it be that I don't know about this? I have Lenahan's book on Isle Royale shipwrecks. I've got the Submerged Cultural Resources Unit report on Isle Royale shipwrecks. And that they don't mention it. Um, and so I went to the Park Service and I called up the cultural resource manager there, who I knew, and I said, "Hey, did you ever hear of a wreck called the San Antonio at Isle Royale?" And well, she said, "No." I shared this news article with her, and they were dumbfounded. Now, mind you, this was dated 1982. This news article, and this is many years later. Well, I was all about to start an expedition. We were ready to get the Park Service together and go and find the wreck of the San Antonio. When I called up my friend Pat Labadie, who at that time was the director of the Canal Park Museum, or the curator of the Canal Park Museum at Duluth. I said, "Pat, I found this amazing account of a new shipwreck at Isle Royale called the San Antonio." And Pat just sort of chuckled and said, "Yeah, you're not the first." So there's a little story behind it. And what Pat told me essentially is that this was a hoax that was intentionally perpetrated. And it was the beginning for me of learning how to think critically and being careful about things that seem too good to be true. The way the story goes is that back in the 1980s, Jerry Eliason and Craig Smith found the wreck of the Judge Hart, beautifully preserved wreck up on Lake Superior in Canadian waters. And a very prominent marine historian on the lakes at the time was asked to write the press release about the find and the history of the wreck. And he wrote a really well done history of the Judge Hart and of Jerry Eliason's find. And he uh, gave that to a reporter, ostensibly as a press release. Well, the reporter turned around and put their own name on the article and put it out on the AP wire, and it went on the national wire with the reporter's name on it as though the reporter had written it. And that was really offensive to the historian, who put a lot of time and effort and didn't even get a single mention. So the historian thought, well, I'll get even with them. And he cooked up this really elaborate story. If you read this article, he talks about these kids who were, out on Isle Royal working, and they were interns at the National Archives then, and they decided to um, look into the records of the lighthouse there at Siskiwit Bay on um, uh, Malone Bay, and then it, they, it says they looked at the vessel enrollments for this. They looked at all sorts of, National Archives records, and were able to, find out that this schooner had wrecked on San Antonio Reef, and they went there and scuba dived it, and sure enough, there it is. And there's a bit of discussion about the significance of scow schooners in the lumber trade. Big write-up. Well, anyway, the marine historian arranged for this article to be leaked to that reporter. And of course, the reporter took the bait and once again grabbed the article, released it under their own name without crediting the marine historian at all. It went on the national wire, and within a few days, this was all debunked. The Park Service was called, and they said, no, this is a hoax. And they had to print a retraction, and the reporter really had egg on their face, as did the paper there for printing this. And hopefully the reporter learned a lesson, that you have to vet these things, and you really shouldn't just take the article and put your name on it. Um, and so I learned a lesson too. And the lesson I learned is that, you know, wrecks don't come out of nowhere like this. They have a paper trail, a big paper trail. And we need to do our own research. So often I hear marine historians, divers, who are just reading someone else's book that was written 10, 20, 30 years ago. When they want to research a wreck, they just go back to books, modern books that were written. Well, when you do that, you are relying on the skill and, frankly, the honesty of that person who wrote that book. And a lot of times, particularly in the Great Lakes maritime history circles, there tends to be this culture of hero worship for a lot of the early maritime historians. Um, and it's not that they weren't great maritime historians. It's that times have changed, and they didn't have the internet. They didn't have a lot of the resources we have now. So not to disparage these early historians, but if you're relying on these books written by these old guys back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you are doing yourself a disservice. Not because they're not good books, not because they're not well written, but because there's so much more information out there now. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. So let's move on. Great Lakes treasure mythology. So this is one of the things that really gave rise on the Great Lakes region to a lot of the stories we find about wrecks that really aren't true. And this came out of sort of the ethos of, the 1940s and 50s. This idea that, there's treasures to be found, and treasure hunting became a big deal, and a lot of works were put out. Arthur Fredrickson, for example, who was a great historian actually, but he started putting out these treasure maps, and he says that, you know, $2 billion worth of stuff on on these Great Lakes ships down, or these other treasure maps you see, treasure ships of the Great Lakes, Great Lakes Treasure Wreck Atlas, Calvin Deviney's treasure maps of the lakes. That was really the big focus here on the Great Lakes. And it was really not true. Everybody knew that these wrecks really were carrying cargoes, right? If you had something really valuable back in the 1800s and you needed it shipped, boy, putting it on a Great Lakes ship was a bad investment, because Great Lakes ships wrecked at just a fantastic rate. And it's the nature of commerce on the lakes. It's a small enclosed space with thousands of vessels traveling at any one, and bad weather, and poorly mapped shoals. And so ships wrecked every day on the Great Lakes North. So if you had gold, if you had something valuable, you weren't going to ship it on the Great Lakes. You were going to probably be safer shipping it over land. So this sort of treasure hunting ethos has continued to impact our approach to Great Lakes maritime history to this day, because so much of our literature is fraught with this kind of you know hyperbole, I guess would be a good word, exaggeration, um, claims that these wrecks are valuable, and this is what gave rise to really our culture of sort of salvaging brass items from shipwrecks and having shipwreck artifact collections. These artifacts weren't really worth much. They were in the divers' minds, though. You know, and so it hastened the destruction of a lot of our wrecks, but really it also obfuscated a lot of the stories of our shipwrecks. So what I mean by obfuscated is it clouded the real story, hid the real story of the ships behind this treasure stuff. So um, that is a big part of what shaped the way people talk about shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, is this treasure ethos. The treasure era was a big deal on the Great Lakes. There were a lot of people that were doing this sort of stuff. Probably chief among them were Walter and Teddy Remick. They wrote for True Treasure magazine. This is the Remicks. They were from Ohio. Um, and they were armchair wreck hunters. This is an interesting picture because this is the Remix, and right next to them is Jim Kennard, who would go on to become one of the most famous and successful wreck hunters on the Great Lakes. But he knew them when he was young. And the Remix, every single wreck was a treasure wreck. And if you read True Treasure or any of the other magazines they wrote for, in fact, I've got a large collection of their original articles. I bought a part of their collection. Um, Everything was carrying, um, whiskey, money, um, you know, you see here the authentic wrecks that have been checked and contain valuables in one form or another, all from the files of Great Lakes research, and none of this was actually true when you look at it. Um, just ginned up. And then, of course, you had salvage laws for weekend divers, make money in diving. This idea that there was a lot of treasure wrecks on the Great Lakes, and so people started not just to take wrecks that existed and make things up, but they started to make up ships that didn't exist. And so we started to see that pretty early on because people were, I call it salting their maps and salting their books to sell them. So here's two of the earliest ones that don't exist at all. This one even has um, GPS coordinates. It's the frigate Le Jean Florin. And this wreck first appears in Carl Heaton's Directory of Great Lakes Shipwrecks. I believe that's the first one, and I think he cooked it from whole cloth. And that was about 1962, I think. And he says that on July 2nd, 1721, it sank 10 to 15 miles off of Barcelona, New York, with gold and bullion, worth $500,000 on board. So, where'd this come from? Well, first of all, Barcelona, New York didn't exist in 1721. Nothing much existed in 1721. On the Great Lakes, very little. There was a few small French settlements. There was a lot of Indian villages. There were no decked vessels at all in 1721 on the Great Lakes, French or otherwise. The Griffon and the few little vessels that had been on Lake Ontario were long gone from LaSalle, and there wasn't to be another decked vessel in the Great Lakes really until the 17. Well, there was one on Lake Superior, which was sort of an anomaly. Laurent, the mining explorer, had a small vessel, but otherwise we didn't see vessels on the Great Lakes again until really the 1760s. So, how could this be? That people could buy into this. Well, this is a confabulation. There was a vessel called Le Jean Florin, and it was lost off of Barcelona, but the Barcelona it was lost off of was Spain. And the pirate, Jean Florin, um, was actually a figure, I think, later than 1721. And so there's a lot of problems with this. This wreck was completely created for maps. And you still see it from time to time. If even some of the literature of Barcelona, New York, the city, they talked about this as being a real thing for years and years. Another one is Le Blanc Henri, right? This is a ship that was alleged to have wrecked on June 17th, 1764 on Wolf Island Spit, and she was carrying gold and silver bullion. Where you would get gold and silver bullion on the Great Lakes, I'm not quite sure, but this is another one that never happened. There was never a vessel of this name. And one of the things that these authors really, really counted on was people being ignorant and not doing their own research, right? Or not, or just throwing up their hands and saying, yeah, we can't know what vessels were in existence back then because nobody kept any records. Well, that's not true. There are extensive records of from New France and of every vessel that was really on the lakes. The French kept very good records of their vessels. So did the British. We actually have the hull plans for a lot of the early British vessels that were on the Great Lakes. So these don't stand up to even moderate inquiry. Um, and these are the two first examples of famous wrecks that were written about by many authors and just um, don't exist. So a couple of things I show here. This a descriptive list of treasure maps and charts in the Library of Congress. This has some Great Lakes stuff. The F.L. Kaufman book, which is now highly collectible, his Atlas of Treasure Maps, has one for each of the Great Lakes, and every one of these is a treasure uh, wreck. Um, Lonsdale's Guide to Sunken Ships in American Waters is also a treasure book. So these books are all quite collectible now, but also just fraught with misinformation. I talked about Legend Florent a little bit and the treasure ethos. Paul Ackerman, as late as the 1980s, put that on his Lake Erie dive chart and stated that it existed. But like I say, um, it has no basis in fact. We do know of all the French vessels that were on the Great Lakes. If you read George Cuthbertson's book Freshwater, he did excellent archival research into the French vessels, and then there have been other authors that have since. So didn't exist. Likewise with Le Blanc Henri, I believe this is actually shown on this map of shipwrecks of the Great Lakes, which is still out there and sells pretty widely. This is the French fleet. These are all the vessels that were on the lakes. We know there was no vessel called Le Blanc Henri. Again, a made-up ship. Um, let's fast forward to another wreck that never happened, and that is the famous copper wreck of the schooner Kitty Reeves. The story has it that she foundered in November of 1870 off Tawas, Michigan, carrying a load of copper from Lake Superior. And there was a fairly good book that was actually written not long ago, and many of you know the post from my website about the fellow who claimed in 1948 that he found this. He got this letter from this guy that had found a wreck there, and there was a near it there was another wreck that I think it was the schooner Summit. They were salvaging the schooner Summit, and the salver claimed that next to it he found a wreck with a hold full of copper ore, which kind of continued to fuel this. I think John O'Shea, the professor, I think he was from Michigan State, wrote an excellent book, Ships and Shipwrecks of the Ausable Shores region of Western Lake Huron. And I think he does a good job in there of debunking this one. The big thing here, I think, that I can say is that there's no record of any vessel ever existing named the Kitty Reeves, and we have very complete vessel records. We know of every vessel that existed on the Great Lakes, particularly as late as the 1870s. You couldn't have a commercial vessel on the Great Lakes at that point and not have it registered. The other thing is that all vessel traffic through the Soo locks was tracked and reported by the papers. We have no schooners carrying copper in I think, that whole year coming down. Very uncommon for schooners to carry copper. It was generally carried by steamers. The other thing that was noted about this is that the vessel had no insurance. That could never have happened. All the copper coming out of the copper country was owned by the Boston copper conglomerates. All of it. They were wealthy and they insured every shipment. It would not be possible to load copper on a schooner and send it through the Soo Locks and have it be both uninsured and never reported as having passed through. We know that this is a complete fabrication. And again, you know, this one wasn't intentionally put in there to sell maps. This one was actually just the result of the wishful thinking of a few different people. One misreport that this hull had copper ore in it, which the salver probably was just mistaken. It probably had iron ore. And then the 1948 account, the local grocer from Cleveland, I'm blanking on his name, who kind of spent his life trying to prove that this wreck existed. Wishful thinking. And I think that was brought on by that whole, treasure hunting ethos of the time. So, Kitty Reeves. Um, the other one that, has really suffered then from the treasure hunting ethos and the mythology and the sort of the glorification of treasure hunting is the Griffon. Um, People have looked for the Griffon for years, and if and people, claim to be searching for her, they tend to find her. Because there are thousands of degraded old wooden keels all over the Great Lakes. And there's a lot of wishful thinking based upon this treasure hunting stuff and a real lack of critical analysis. You get this whole idea that people seem to think that there are no records of the Griffon and no way to actually research her. The truth of the matter is that there's more written about the Griffon by the people who sailed on her than almost any other shipwreck that ever happened on the Great Lakes. And yet, there have been at least 40 claims in the regional media since 1840. Um, and of course, the media fuels this. There's very little critical analysis. In fact, when I first started researching the Griffon, I did it because I thought she probably was a hoax. I felt that, yes, LaSalle certainly existed, but that this Griffon thing might have just been inserted into the record by people in the 1900s who were part of this treasure mythology. Of course, you know, we found out later it wasn't, but here we have, Ori Vale standing next to the original or Tobermory site. He claimed this was the Griffon. Again, he found an old keel and ribs. Automatically, it's the Griffon. And just to show you the lack of critical thinking, this is Raleigh Murphy, a friend of C.H.J. Snider, the Canadian maritime historian. And Raleigh Murphy was a marine artist and of great repute. And his way of proving that they had the Griffon, that the Manitoulin site, I'm sorry, that the Tobermory site was the Griffon, is he came up with this fanciful drawing here of what he felt the Griffon would look like, and then he showed how how the keel and ribs that they found sort of fit into it, right? And that was proof. They actually put this forth as proof. Well, you know, people who don't think critically don't realize that, well, he just invented this whole ship, and made things line up, right? It's the sheer plan of the Griffon. Um, we do have, like I said, a lot of primary historical sources, more than most people can even read. A lot of them are in French, unfortunately, and that's dissuaded some people. The most dubious source we have is Hennepin's, and that's the only one that's really that was in English. Many of them have been translated. Um, so what happened? We started to get scientific, and nautical archaeology, came to the Great Lakes really starting in the 1970s and 80s. And very early in the 1980s, a Texas A&M grad student named Paul Hundley decided he was going to investigate the Tobermory site as part of his master's thesis, because Texas A&M had started a nautical archaeology program. So he was allowed to cast the remains, which were at Tobermory, and bring the casts down to Texas A&M and reconstruct that hull. He also went to the site where the Griffon remains had allegedly lay And he did an actual archaeological examination of all the debris that was around the site of that original old hull, and he found a bunch of stuff. Now, what he did is he took those existing timbers and he lengthened them, out to show the shear plan from what was there at the hull bed, and he was able to conclude that what we really had was an 1850s era Mackinaw boat built at Collingwood, Ontario. And he was able to conclude that also because of the china and a lot of the metalwork that was left around that wreck. And so, you know, this is, the kind of thing that started to debunk a lot of the famous wrecks that, either never happened or were ginned up to be something they weren't. A few other famous wrecks that are pretty dubious. The Alice Hackett, allegedly the first wreck that ever occurred on Lake Huron. I think she's in Captain Jack Parker's Lake Huron Shipwrecks book. No record of a vessel named Alice Hackett ever having existed. How did she get into the historic record? We may never know. It could be, based on some sort of other vessel by a different name, but a wreck that definitely, there was no ship named the Alice Hackett. Likewise, there's a fairly well-known account of the loss of the schooner Redbird at Madison Dock, Ohio, that we also know there was no vessel named Redbird that was lost there. This is another one we don't know where this came from. I think here we have it. And there's a Redbird Beach. I think that's part of it, that they felt that the beach was named after a schooner, maybe. But two famous wrecks that never happened. Lastly, I want to talk about some urban legends from that treasure era. Probably the biggest one that still has legs is the Poverty Island treasure. And I know there are some people who have spent their lives on this. And, I'm not here to disparage anybody who really believes deeply in this, but I believe that it's hokum, and I believe it came out of the 1940s and 50s treasure hunt, culture. This story does not have very deep roots. If you actually try to research how far back this Poverty Island treasure or the other flavors of it, they're all Confederate gold accounts basically. Um, and then there's some, I guess, there's some real reason to think that the Confederacy did have some gold that was unaccounted for. But, the fact getting that gold to the Great Lakes, it really tortures the historical record and kind of does violence to the intellect when you research it. Sending gold up the Great Lakes would have been the absolute worst thing to do during the Civil War. We had revenue cutters all over the Great Lakes. It was heavily policed. There was a POW camp on Lake Erie. This was not where you wanted to go with your gold. And then the whole, sort of theory that you're going to put it up to Canada and to England, there are a lot of historical problems with that. Most historians discredit any of these, Confederate gold stories. But, there are people who get this fever, where they get focused on trying to, they convince themselves. And we see this over and over again, not just with the Poverty Island gold. We see it with, people that claim they found the Griffon, and we have things like, the what do we call it, the mystery stick. Um, Everyone knew that was a pond net stake, but the fellow who he deeply believed that he had the Griffon, and nobody could convince him otherwise. And I think it's the same way with a lot of the folks who are interested in these, mythological treasures. Um, there is no evidence you can give them that will convince them that they're not right. They are not open to disproval. And that's really anti-scientific. They start with a conclusion and work backwards and say, yeah, this exists, it happened. But when you start to ask for proof, they can't produce it. All they can do is come up with oral tradition And maybe it's, written, but it's written oral tradition. You know what I mean? It's articles written about hearsay. And so, uh, there's no way they're not looking at doing real research to find out, if there's any truth to it, because in their mind, there doesn't have to be truth. They believe it on faith. So let's move to one last outright hoax that I got involved in a little bit, and that's the Kinross incident. And if any of you are familiar with the Kinross incident, I believe it was 1962, and I'm not looking at my notes, so you guys have to forgive me if I get some dates wrong. There actually was an F-89 Scorpion that was scrambled from the Kinross Air Force Base up in northern Michigan because an unidentified flying object had been tracked going around 500 miles an hour out over the Lake Michigan. It went out over about where Sault Ste. Marie is and headed out towards northern, I'm sorry, I said Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, headed out over northern Lake Superior. And this F-89 Scorpion actually closed in, was able to catch up with the unidentified flying object, and disappeared from radar suddenly. That's true. All of that's true. It's a really fascinating episode. Um, what happened though, the UFO circles. This was a huge thing in UFO circles, kind of the holy grail of the UFO community. Well, it must have been about 15 years ago now. A guy named Adam Jimenez went on the record suddenly, announcing that he had found this plane, this F-89 Scorpion on the bottom of Lake Superior. And 100 yards off of it was this disc, this round disc. And what was this? He said it was a UFO. And this was the Kinross Scorpion and UFO. Well, he got a lot of notoriety out of it. He made it onto a few radio shows, a few national TV programs. And he claimed he was with this group called the Great Lakes Shipwreck Group, something like that. And they were out of Muskegon. Well, that all fell apart real quickly. I got some calls about him and asked, who is this guy? People were trying to vet him. And I said, well, no one's ever heard of him over in Michigan. And he said he has this homemade side scan sonar that he found this within 500 feet of water. And at that time, 15 years ago, nobody had that kind of technology. You couldn't have done it. And I started to look at these images, and I started to realize, well, yes, they're sonar images, but they're old military sonar images. And I researched the guy a little more, and it turned out he was an ex-Navy technician, and he had access to this kind of ignition, and he faked it. He wanted his 15 minutes, and he got it. As soon as people scratched the surface, he disappeared. The Great Lakes, his Great Lakes Shipwreck group, the web page disappeared. He stopped answering his phone, and it turned out that it all was a hoax. He had completely invented it. And the truth of the matter is, when these jets crash, they turn into thousands of pieces. Some mostly no bigger than a tin can, especially if they go in at high speed. So, is the Kinross F-89 Scorpion on the bottom of Lake Superior? Sure, but it's probably a really, really widely scattered debris field. And I believe that what they were tracking was probably a Russian spy plane, which makes sense, right, for that era of the Cold War. Um, not Martians in little discs. All right. So how do we spot mythology and folklore, and how do we separate that from the truth? How do we really find out what's true and what's mythology? Well, I'll begin by saying that mythology and folklore are important because there's usually a grain of truth behind it, right? When there's a story like the Alice Hackett, the first ship on Lake Huron, I'd like to find out where that came from, you know, um, uh, because usually there's a reason, right? Especially older accounts like that. Some of the later ones, were really just thrown into the record by treasure hunters. Um, but once you dig into it, how can you tell what's true? And I think what we want to look for are obvious contradictions with historical fact, right? If you know that, there are many things that make a situation unlikely to have happened, then it's probably not true, right? If we find that there are no primary sources or records that exist when they clearly should exist, right? Especially with something like the Kitty Reeves, right? We should have records of that, and the fact that they don't exist, particularly for that era, completely, you know, makes her unfeasible. Wrecks and accounts that seem to come out of nowhere, that don't have any basis, any trail, any paper trail. Things like the Kinross story. This guy, who claimed he was a wreck hunter. Well, none of us had ever heard of him, right? Things that are handed down by oral tradition, things like the Civil War gold, right? There's no record, but a lot of people say, a lot of things have been, said. But if you try to find something in print, that's 100 years, that's from the 1800s, you can't, right? Everything that you find that's in print about it, is after 1960, right? There's no primary source stuff. There's no original documentation, and it usually has an agenda, right? You look at who stands to get money, right? Or and how are they going to appear on TV? Are they going to get a book? You know, um, that's usually what I find is that these things have an agenda, and that's a good way to spot they aren't true. There are a lot of research resources that we can look at, to find if vessels actually existed. I won't go into those too deeply, but um, there are probably one that I don't show here is that's out there now is newspapers.com. If you can't find an account, any sort of mention of a ship or of an incident in newspapers of the day that's older than the treasure, culture period, then it probably didn't exist. So I always try to go before 1900 in the 1800s. You have to find some sort of an account of something that was written before the Great Lakes treasure mania, because after that, you'll find a lot of stuff written in the papers. So that's my talk on famous wrecks that never happened. A number of people gave me good input for this over the years, and I appreciate their help. Um, but when you look at these wrecks, and you hear these stories about treasure, and you hear these stories about the Griffon being found, or other fantastic stories, think critically about it, and don't just go back and read one of these 30-year-old books where they claimed this was true. Do your own research, and what I mean by that isn't going to existing sources. Do original research. Look up things that maybe no other researchers ever found. Go to an archive. Go to the National Archives. Pull records. Go to the newspaper microfilms from the 1800s and look at your local newspaper. There are a lot of small local newspapers on microfilm that no one has ever consulted, and there are probably articles that about some of these instances that we would really like to find. It would be valuable to find in some small local papers that are not on newspapers.com, or that haven't been gone through by all the major researchers, like the Detroit Free Press, the Buffalo Papers, the Chicago Tribune, the Milwaukee Sentinel, the Cleveland papers. Those are all papers that have been gone through real heavily. But check through small papers, like the Houghton, Michigan Daily Mining Gazette, or the Marquette Mining Journal, or some of the small town papers really contain a lot of interesting stuff. So do original research. Don't just read other people's books, because if you do, you're relying on their skill as a researcher and their honesty. And because we now know that there was this whole era of where Great Lakes treasure was completely hyped up, and all Great Lakes shipwrecks had treasure on them. You know, uh, it really infected um, sort of the oral tradition about Great Lakes shipwrecks. The culture surrounding Great Lakes diving was completely impacted by this. So if you want to really know what happened, you really kind of have to be able to see through this stuff. So that's the moral of the story, I guess. So anyway, thank you for tuning in and listening. I hope you enjoyed this talk and that it helps you to become a better researcher and to understand sort of the perils involved in trying to find the truth about Great Lakes shipwrecks. Uh, Thanks a lot, and have a good night.